guess. Hi, welcome everybody. My name is Sean Flynn, and I'm the director of the program on information justice and intellectual property at American University Washington College of Law. And I will be introducing our speakers here and starting off this program. So as the title indicates, this program is going to focus on copyright issues relevant to the TRIPS waiver. And so much of the attention regarding the action of the WTO around COVID has been focusing on the patent side of the equation. What kind of access to patents are needed to create vaccines and promote treatments? But there are also a series of copyright issues that are involved both in the production and supply of vaccines and other treatments, and in the research that's necessary for both creating treatments and doing helpful things like tracking the spread of the virus itself. So mRNA technology, for instance, to create those vaccines, you need access not only to the patents on that invention, but to the algorithms that are needed to apply it. And treatments like ventilators require access to software to repair those devices or to manufacture new ones. And text and data mining technology was used to first discover the vaccines. It was actually an artificial intelligence health firm that discovered the original spread of the COVID virus, and also defined candidates for the vaccines that we've had and for potential future vaccines and treatments that we need. So all of these areas, research, repair of devices, and creation of vaccines and treatments themselves require access to copyright in addition to patents. But our copyright laws, as we'll discuss further in this panel, are highly unequally situated. So in this map, a map of the research exceptions for copyright around the world, there's essentially three different worlds. A first world located largely in North America and down in the southeast, in the countries below China, have laws that are sufficiently open and flexible to allow all of those uses I just mentioned. Text and data mining research, repair of software, creation of alternative treatments and tools. But there's a few countries, something that could be termed as a third world in the copyright for research, where only excerpts are allowed to be used, thus essentially blocking off all of those same tools and activities that I just described. And much of the world is in a yellow for caution. Complicated rules where certain users can use certain works for certain limited purposes, but a full scope of research purposes to allow the kind of uses that we've talked about are not allowed at present. And that leads us to the focus of our topic today, which is on the international environment. In that fragmented world, there's a need for emergency action, at least to respond to the needs of COVID. Of course, COVID just becomes a canary in a coal mine and the problems are much deeper. But in order to give immediate access to, for instance, distance learning materials, or to immediately enable researchers to contribute both to making the current vaccines and also investing in the research that's needed to create the new ones. There's a need to, on at least an emergency level, get over the copyright barriers that can block that activity. And the international environment in this area is muddy at best. The most directly relevant international provision in the copyright treaties and the Berne Convention is Article 17. And there's an academic debate about whether the word permit means permit, whether there really is an emergency authorization within the Berne Convention in regards to copyright. And so activities here in the WTO may be able to help clarify that issue as well. It's certainly not an issue that has been fully clarified within the WIPO copyright treaties. And so with that, I'm going to turn over our panelists to kind of go through each step of basically the argument that I presented to you today. To first discuss some of the problems of the unequal distribution of copyright and the problems of educators and researchers and librarians and other cultural institutions that need access to copyright during COVID. And then we'll come back to the legal discussion that I just framed about what might be useful for the international system in general and for the WTO specifically to take into account as it considers emergency actions that are needed to respond to COVID. So first, and I'll introduce our speakers as we go, but first, let me turn to Patricia Diaz, who's a researcher in Uruguay and has been spending considerable effort producing some really outstanding visuals and outcomes about what the copyright situation looks like in Latin America. And specifically, how does your research, Patricia, reflect on what countries need in order to respond to some of the challenges that we know exist because of COVID? Patricia, over to you.
Thanks. Thanks, Sean, for inviting me to be part of this panel. Well, my name is Patricia Diaz from DATISOC. DATISOC is a Uruguayan Data and Society Laboratory. Today, I'm going to talk about why it is important to incorporate copyright issues into TRIPS waiver for COVID from a Latin American perspective. Let me share my screen. I can share it. I don't see my browser. Yes, I can see it, sorry. Here is my presentation. Well, this year, in April, I think, DATISOC published the report called Report on the Status of Copyright Flexibilities in Latin American Countries. It is a work carried out jointly with the Charisma Foundation. This report includes the analysis of the legislation of 10 countries: Argentina, Uruguay, Paraguay, Brazil, Panama, Chile, Peru, Mexico, Colombia, and Ecuador. This is the address of the website for you can download this report from this address. And the report includes a tool with interactive maps where you can consult the situation of exceptions and limitations to copyright in each country for different uses. Well, as you know, Latin American countries, the right granted to authors and to copyright holders do not have more flexibilities than those specifically listed by law. We usually don't have open or flexible clauses. And in addition, the flexibilities are usually interpreted restrictively. So new categories cannot be generated by analogy or by appealing to the general principles of law. Those circumstances make necessary the continuous review of copyright limitations and exceptions, taking into account technological advances and new social practices to maintain an adequate balance between access and monopoly. Unfortunately, this has not happened in Latin America. In general, we can say that we have an anachronistic laws or a regulatory delay with some exceptions, of course. This anachronism generates a greater legal insecurity for educational institutions and researchers, specifically in the emergency situation due to COVID pandemic. In our interactive map tool, we analyze the presence or absence of specific exemptions for some uses. Let me show you some examples. The first example is this map shows which countries have some specific exemption for online education. only the Ecuadorian copyright law expressly and clearly includes exceptions to copyright for face-to-face, semi-face-to-face, dual, online, and distance study or learning processes. This map is about compilation or anthologies for educational use. The use of compilations of fragments or selection of readings is widespread custom in Latin America. Universities use it for research or private use studies. This type of limited anthologies are expressly allowed only in one country, in Ecuador. This map is about public lending for libraries and archives. Only 3 of the 10 countries that we studied include a broad exception that include the public lending of any type of works. In the countries in yellow, the library loan is limited, and in the countries in red, it's not legal. Attention, we are not talking about digital access or controlled digital lending. This slide refers to physical format lending. The only country that has an exemption about digital access is Ecuador too, but we didn't survey this controlled digital lending in our report. And the next map is about reverse engineering. This technique is used for several purposes, such as study or research or security checks, achieving interoperability in software programs, and usually is not permitted for developing competitive software programs. Reverse engineering techniques require copying the program at least once, and are illegal in 4 of the surveyed countries. Next map is about specific exemptions on text and data mining. Databases are considered works, and to carry out text and data mining analysis on a database, it's necessary to copy it and perform acts of processing like clean, reorder, standardize, and so on. The only country that provides an exemption, a specific exemption for text and data mining is Ecuador, but it only provides it for the context of libraries and archives. I must say that we inquire the existence of specific exemptions while the research on text and data mining developed by Shan, it was considered that this activity may be covered by some communication or production exemptions, but the results are not very different. Text and data mining activities are really insecurely in Latin America. And finally, the last map is about non-consumptive uses. This kind of exemption should generate and enable all uses that require technical or temporary copies, such as caching, streaming, indexing, text and data mining, and many other technical processes typical of the operation of computing devices and the internet. Countries in yellow allow certain type of technical copies of works for the exclusive purpose of facilitating network communications. No country provides an exception that covers this type of use in a generic way. Well, finally, I emphasize that a clear and fair system of exemptions and limitations is necessary here in Latin America for teaching and for scientific research. And it's not feasible to think about negotiating licenses as the only or solution or the best solution, specifically for the Latin American context. That is why it is important to include aspects related to copyright into TRIPS waiver for COVID in our region. We must take into account the cultural and economic and market conditions prevailing in each country. For example, the fact that only 1/3 of the Latin American countries have collective managers dedicated to reprography. This must happen for some reason. In recent investigations, we have conducted interviews with university authorities, researchers, and library directors. And here in Uruguay, we have verified some effects derived from legal uncertainty of copyright regime here in Uruguay. Some of them are, I'm finishing with this, censorship against copyright claims, because most claims are solved privately, stillborn innovation project after a risk analysis, barrier for financing innovation projects. Illegal projects do not get funding. Impossible or unjustified transaction costs trying to access to permissions. And finally, impossibility of implementing efficient copyright literacy programs in universities. Copyright literacy programs in universities end up being risk management classes. And well, that's it. I stop sharing. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Patricia. So a little example from a region in which they're very restrictive copyright laws. It shows up, very much red in our map for all kinds of purposes that are really necessary during COVID. And now two speakers that can bring a little bit more experience to the table on these issues and how they affect specifically libraries. So for Teresa Hackett is the Copyright and Libraries Program Manager for EIFL, the Electronic Information for Libraries, that consults over libraries in over 50 developing countries around the world. And Teresa, I will share your slides in just a second, but over to you to help us understand more about how these some of the challenges that COVID is presenting the library sector.
Okay, great. That's great. Thanks very much, Sean. First of all, I'd like to thank the WTO for inviting us here to this forum, which is, I think, very important in the current situation that we're facing. And I think from a library and a research perspective, I would highlight three main barriers to research and discovery relating to the COVID vaccines and treatments. First, Sean, if you could move on to the first slide, thank you. Researchers must be allowed to do the research. So text and data mining, as we heard from Patricia earlier, is a powerful tool that uses computer-based analysis of large amounts of data in order to gain new knowledge. And databases for text and data mining are often managed by the library in an institution. TDM projects often involve copyright protected works. So copyright law or database licenses come into play. So unless you have a copyright exception or a publisher a license that allows TDM, or the database is open access, you will usually need authorization. But the analysis shows, as we have seen from the example from Latin America, is that TDM exceptions around the world are very uneven. So it is permitted in many countries, at least for non-commercial research, but there are clear restrictions in others. So some laws prohibit commercial uses, others impose contractual restrictions. And no law that we have been able to identify explicitly authorizes making the database available across borders. And Dr. Tedros, in his opening statement, talked about the importance of sharing data. And often these research projects are international, collaboration is international, and therefore cross-border uses would be important. And we know the TDM researchers have been tripped up by copyright issues. So a recent paper on vaccine hesitancy and COVID had to be withdrawn because the researchers didn't have the correct publisher permissions. The license had restrictions that didn't permit this activity. And the researchers had used an aggregated database of more than 30,000 different sources of information. So news reports, journals, TV transcripts in 28 languages from nearly every country around the world. So it was a very big database. And this research could never have been done manually. So it really needed text and data mining to be able to do it. The research was published in a peer-reviewed open access journal, the Public Library of Science. But 1 month later, the article had to be withdrawn at the request of the publisher, the university library that managed the license, and the authors. And it was described by the researchers as a very unfortunate event. So there was no malintent intended in this breach of the license conditions, but that's the point. In the middle of a pandemic, we need to support researchers who are doing text and data mining without legal uncertainty or roadblocks. The second issue that I would highlight is that researchers and people, that's us, the general public, must be allowed to read the research. So research on COVID can be recent data, like we've just heard about, or it can be older. It can involve material that is much older. And in fact, it was a library book published 66 years ago that contributed to current global advice on how COVID is spread. So at the start of the pandemic, the virus was thought to spread in heavier droplets that land on surfaces. And the focus was on cleaning surfaces and washing our hands. But a group of scientists believed that the virus was spread in lighter aerosols that are airborne. But they needed to prove it to their peers and to public health officials. And they needed to do this urgently. So they engaged in a kind of detective work where they followed back through citations from reports and studies looking at the spread in other viruses like influenza and in tuberculosis, dating from the 1930s and the 1940s. And eventually, the earliest reference to aerosols was found in a book on TB prevention, published in 1955 by an engineer from Harvard University. And the book was out of print. Now, before COVID, the researcher, who was based in the US, would have got the book through their standard interlibrary loan. So they would have requested, their library would have requested the book from the other library, and the book would have been sent to the researcher. But in COVID times, during lockdown, this wasn't an option. So her university library managed to find a digitized copy of the book in a university library in Michigan. And luckily, this institution was participating in an emergency temporary access service that was set up by a partnership of US libraries to support teaching and research during the lockdowns. So the digitized copy was delivered to the researcher, and the information in there contributed to the development of the science on how COVID was spread. And public health advice then evolved to stress the importance of aerosols and ventilation and mask wearing indoors. And this system of sending the book in this way is known as controlled digital lending. Now, in the US, controlled digital lending is justified under the fair use doctrine, but most countries don't have fair use or the legal conditions to support controlled digital lending. And so in this case, we could see how important this was in getting this key piece of information in order to help with bringing the research forward. So then looking at current research, getting the latest information out fast and for free. Sean, if you go back there, please, to the previous slide. Thanks. Getting it out for fast and for free helps to save lives. So we know that a paper, for example, showing how an anti-inflammatory drug reduced deaths among severely ill COVID patients, that was put on a preprint server, so a publicly available server, was taken up by clinicians a good 3 weeks before it appeared in a peer-reviewed, before similar information appeared in a peer-reviewed journal. But the problem is that around 2/3 of all peer-reviewed journals are behind paywalls. Now, so unless your institution subscribes to that journal, or you as an individual can afford to purchase the articles, which can be anything from $30 to $40 a pop, you won't get to read it. Now, it's important to acknowledge that many publishers lifted paywalls to COVID research at the start of the pandemic. But when we look at the current situation, it's a bit mixed. So analysis shows that around 77% of COVID articles are free to read currently, but that's down from a high of 85% in May 2020. And in a random sample of articles on a big platform, Science Direct, that I've put here on the slide, I could see that 57% of the articles in this one sample of 100 were free to read and 43% were not. Also, at the start of the pandemic, over 100 publishers provided complimentary expanded access for library consortia. But by now, that expanded access has mostly expired. So what we can see is that paywall access is creeping back, even for COVID research. But as long as there is a pandemic, researchers need full and unrestricted access to research outputs. And then finally, on to the third point, which is that libraries and archives must be allowed to save the research. So as we have seen, researchers and scientists need access to a wide range of data and resources to study and draw lessons from COVID. And this data comes in all types and all formats, old and new. So for example, if you think of a behavioral scientist who is advising governments on public health messaging to slow down the spread of COVID, they will consult surveys and social media, news reports and posters, as well as professional journals and books. But it's estimated that a website, for example, is changed or deleted within 100 days. So if that information is not saved now, the content is lost forever. And cultural heritage institutions, so libraries, archives, and museums, have a primary responsibility for long-term preservation of our cultural and scientific heritage. And in this case, it's to identify, collect, and preserve COVID collections for future generations of scientists and scholars. But preservation strategies always require the making of copies. But over a quarter of WIPO member states do not expressly permit preservation, even for print formats. And in others, the exception applies only to the reproduction right. So what about audiovisual materials, for example? Or it may be that digital copies are excluded. So libraries in every country should be clearly allowed to properly preserve COVID collections for scholarship and research. So for all those reasons, copyright is an integral part of the TRIPS waiver for COVID and is an important part of helping us address and respond to the pandemic. Thank you, Sean.
Great, thank you, Teresa. And we have another prominent library expert with us, Dick Kuya, who hails from Uganda, but is currently in the University of South Carolina. Dick, over to you.
Thank you, Sean. Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right, let me share my screen if you'll allow me to. Can you see my screen? Okay,
Yep,
good. Thank you. So as Sean mentioned, I am Dick Kaoya. I'm an associate professor at the School of Information Science, University of South Carolina. But the name suggests or may suggest I'm originally from Uganda, Africa. I've been a resident in the US for over 18 years. I've done a lot of my work in Africa looking at the issues of copyright and access to knowledge. One of the biggest projects I led was the African Copyright and Access to Knowledge project between 2006 and 2010. So the issue of limitations and exceptions is an issue that we've been interested in as researchers, as activists, really trying to understand the situation in Africa. Today, I want to speak very briefly about limitations and exceptions in the digital environment in Africa, or more appropriately, the problem of limitations and exceptions in Africa. Prior to COVID-19, as most of us already knew, we understood that Africa in general, African countries don't have sufficient or appropriate limitations and exceptions to support a variety of activities in online environment. So COVID-19 was the perfect storm to illustrate why this is a major crisis. Today, I want to illustrate that using research from two sources, more recent research, more recent than what we did back in the 2000s. First, using the analysis of work done by Professor Kenny Cruz by the Electronic Information for Libraries. This was a study done by Professor Kenny Cruz for the World Intellectual Property Organization, trying to understand the status of limitations and exceptions for libraries around the world. As you can see in this situation, the question is whether digital works are generally permitted, and these are the findings in the African context. For instance, the question of whether libraries can make copies for internal library work, only 3 countries or 6% permitted those kind of activities. Majority did not allow any kind of digital copies. So there is a general lack of digital library exceptions across the continent. Second, on the question of whether libraries can make copies of works for research, which is the main theme of our presentation or session, again, you see very few countries have any kind of exception for digital research. So making of copies, text and data mining, which involves making copies to support research. And finally, you have the question of whether libraries can make digital copies of works for preservation. Unfortunately, again, only a very small number of countries have those kind of exceptions, which for libraries is unfortunate because preservation is a very important function of libraries and archives. And of course, oftentimes we use it to preserve materials that are out of print or materials that have deteriorated, physical materials that have deteriorated. But increasingly, we also need to preserve born digital materials. So this is a very important function for libraries. To not have sufficient provisions within copyright law across the continent to do this means that most libraries are not able to provide these services. The second area is in the area of teaching. Again, here we already understood that there is a huge problem. In this case, I'm using data from 2 sources, Education International and the Professor Teresa Nobre of Comonia. Here I've highlighted 3 areas where you see clearly that there are important limitations and exceptions for teaching in the digital environment are generally missing. For instance, on the question of whether if teachers want to record a TV program to show in a class, is this legal? You see that the vast majority of the countries in Africa do not have any provisions. Examples of these include Egypt, Morocco, South Africa, Angola, Cameroon, Kenya, and Mozambique. Only a handful have any kind of provisions that would allow this kind of activity. These are Ghana, Senegal, and Nigeria. On the question of whether if a teacher wants to share an article in a classroom or over a school network, again, in a digital environment, that is a very important function or activity, because otherwise, how do you share electronic resources if you're teaching virtually or online, as the case has been in a few places during COVID-19. Again, the vast majority of countries have no provisions, similar to what we saw with regards to the creating of online or recording of videos, TVs, programs for sharing. So the same countries, Egypt, Morocco, South Africa, Angola, Cameroon, Kenya, and Mozambique don't have anything, and these are just examples. So that again limits what teachers can or cannot do legally can do in a digital environment. Finally, the issue of whether if teachers want to show and discuss an online video in the classroom, again, we see sort of mixed bag here, where again, a number of countries don't have any kind of provisions. And these include Egypt, Morocco, Cameroon, or Mozambique. And the others, it's not clear whether that is permissible. So overall, this is the situation in which COVID has happened in Africa, and it's been very clear in the last year and a half why a lot of institutions, whether it's institutions of higher learning or lower education settings, could not do online. Of course, we have to caution and mention that copyright is only part of a mix of factors or constraints to online learning and online activities. Others include lack of access to technology, lack of access to internet, or internet that is sufficient to support online learning. But increasingly, as African education institutions and libraries turn to digital environment to support digital activities, it's very clear that most of the African copyright laws are out of step with the necessary exceptions and limitations to support those kind of activities. With that, I want to pass on back to Sean to move on to another region. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Dick. So I think in summary, and obviously we could have many more presentations on the different facets, but I think the summary of this part is that there are urgent needs that have become even more urgent through COVID, needs to access materials online, needs to use materials digitally, including for research and uses directly related to vaccines, but also in relation to education and use of libraries and just maintenance of other institutions that actualize human rights. So we have with us Alan Rocha, who's an international lawyer based in Brazil at the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro. And I want to come back, Alan, to the legal question that we started off with, which is that, is there a need? Why is there a need? How might there be a need for international organizations to play a role in helping to clarify or promote the use of flexibilities that could respond to these various needs for uses of copyright as responses to COVID? And I think you mentioned you might want to look at Berne Article 10 during your presentation, so I will share, Berne Article 17, so I will share a version of that for the audience. So go ahead, Alan.
Hello. First of all, thank you very much for this opportunity here. And from what we've seen so far, from the speakers before, it's very clear that vaccines, although vaccines are the most visible uh, development that we wanted to protect us against not only COVID, but all other any other health issues, it's not enough to actually share vaccines, to reach the vaccines and to actually make them available, to make them tested, to make them accepted, to make them widespread. We do need to go beyond vaccines and actually include copyright in any of the discussions that we have regarding uh, access to vaccine and overcoming extreme situations like the ones we are living now with the pandemics. So copyright plays a huge role in actually allowing us to reach the right health remedies for the pandemics that we're living now. And that comes to there's a legal question very important there. Although in terms of patents, there are different rules that have shown the need whenever a country is in need for because of an emergency to waiver some of those rights to make a compulsory license and other mechanisms that are available. In terms of copyright, that's not so clear. We do have Article 17 in Berne, which says it does say that the country, any country of the union may permit or not or control the production, reproduction, dissemination of such works. However, academically speaking, there's been a huge debate on whether that applies only in terms of censorship or whether the permit word is way more encompassing in its meaning as to include uh, one type of compulsory license or some type of copyright waiver when it comes to emergency situations, to extreme situations like the ones we are living now. So there is a huge debate on that, and there hasn't been a clear position for any of the legitimate international bodies on it. So there is a very clear need for that, and this is the specific time where we mostly need it. So when we are here at WTO, which is one of the main international multilateral arenas to actually discuss these issues and to move forward with these issues, and actually um, promoting an interpretation or a view of Article 17 of Berne that is in tune with actually the need for balancing interests with TRIPS actually brings about very clearly in the first few articles in terms of its principles and so on is a very important need. It's very important at this moment. So pushing copyright outside of the TRIPS waiver is not a good solution because actually does not actually move forward in terms of reaching our goal, which is overcoming this pandemic, not only overcoming this pandemic, but also setting the stage for overcoming any future, which we hope we won't have any future disaster situation. And that means that WTO is right now in a position to make a very substantial step in that direction, considering there hasn't been any strong legitimate position on Article 17 of Berne, and considering TRIPS incorporated Berne as a whole, including Article 17, it is part of the WTO roles to actually face the issue and at least clarify the issue whether the permit word in the Article 17 includes also extreme situations, not only like pandemics, but also other other emergency situations that countries may face themselves alone or a certain region may face or the world may face like we're living now. So leaving copyright aside, it's not gonna help us as much as it could in reaching the goal of preventing new situations like that, of overcoming the difficulties that for example, the pandemic brought us. So it's highly, highly, highly important that WTO members and delegates face these issues. And the path to actually face these issues is to look at Article 17 with a more contemporary view, and considering the circumstances that we're living now and that we've known to have lived before. And to give you an example of that we've come in terms of open access on education and spreading of correct and liable informations. Some time ago, we had a Zika virus possible international emergency, and that was actually tackled and solved before it became a very international strong issue, due to the ability of researchers and libraries and government to access material that was produced, to access research that was produced on that issue. That example is a very strong example that we bring from Brazil. Brazil actually faced that issue by making all the papers available to all the researchers, and that's why the results were reached so much quicker than they would otherwise. And we see the same thing repeating with the COVID vaccine and COVID emergency happening. If we don't unblock the roads for knowledge, unblock the roads for research, we will not be able to internationally be prepared to face new emergencies like this one. And this moment, the WTO delegates are meeting. Next week will be the strongest meeting, but starting today with the meetings, I think it's highly, highly important due to the concern that every delegate has shown in solving and moving forward the COVID issue, but not only moving forward beyond the COVID issues, but preparing, being more prepared for any other emergency issue that comes about. And we should not, therefore, focus only in patents and industrial property issues, but also on copyright. Copyright, because it protects every form of communication, every form of expression. It does include all scientific forms of it as well. And by doing so, and by us not having a pathway, a clear pathway to make these works available and circulate quickly and fast in order for other research in other places, in everywhere, being able to get that knowledge and move forward with it and recontribute to that knowledge and rebuild on it, we are not going to be able to internationally face new challenges, which we hope are not going to come, but we cannot live based on hope. So my expectation, and this is the case, my hope as a copyright lawyer, also coming from Brazil, which is a developing country, which faces a lot of the issues of other developing countries, is that the international community is able to actually move forward the lack of the clearance for copyright use that we have now. So with that, I would finish my presentation, my very quick presentation, by actually insisting on WTO delegates to do seriously consider the copyright waiver that's needed to actually develop research and develop solutions for COVID or other health or international pandemic issues that we may face now or in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Alan. So maybe just to recap some of that ultimate presentation. So part of our purpose today was to introduce some of the copyright issues that are arising within COVID responses, both in response particular to the creation of vaccines, which just require access to copyright technology, to treatments, which also requires access to copyrighted technology, but then on the research and access to cultural and educational institutions, which hasn't been the focus of the waiver debate so far. But as the process goes forward within the WTO, a question that should be concerning delegates is the extent to which whatever action is taken here, that it applies to all the intellectual property that's related to the particular social goals. And that's including copyright as well. So thus far, I believe the proposals of South Africa and India, the statements in support of the United States, have both addressed all intellectual property in relation to either vaccines or vaccine treatments, depending on which version we're looking at. But some of the proposals have been to restrict measures to compulsory licenses or to issues of patents, etc. And that would leave a lacuna within the available policy responses. And then in addition, there are some issues that won't immediately be addressed by the WTO that may be addressed in forums like the World Intellectual Property Organization. So WTO action as a subsequent agreement on the same topic could be used to interpret the Berne Convention. So that's the rules of the Vienna Convention. So the action in the WTO could help address interpretation of the Berne Convention, since the Berne Convention is subsumed within the TRIPS agreement. So that's an important qualification. But then there may be action that takes place in other forums as well. Teresa, do you want to address that a little further? The things that have been going on and that may go on in the World Intellectual Property Organization that are relevant, particularly as the GA is meeting next week. And then there's also processes, for instance, at the SCCR. So any final words of advice or reflection for delegates that are watching both of those processes?
Sure. Well, thanks very much, Sean. Yeah, I mean, it's, as I think was mentioned by some of the speakers, I mean, some of these issues have really thrown into sharp relief some of the more general issues that we know that we are facing with regard to how information is distributed and accessed and used around the world. And these issues have been under discussion at WIPO for many years in the Standing Committee on Copyright and Related Rights. And so the pandemic has put like a spotlight on some of these many issues that delegates over in that forum have been discussing and debating. And these include the need for digital preservation. They include the need for online access to education. They include the need to cross-border uses. So all of those issues that we've been talking about here today are more, have been subject to a lot of research and debate, and indeed emerging and developing consensus among countries on the importance of these issues. So we've seen, for example, during the pandemic, how different copyright laws treat the use of classroom teaching compared to online teaching. And online teaching is not going to stop with the end of the pandemic, so we need to be able to provide access to online teaching as well, access to library books for educational use and exams. We've also had some issues of getting access to those books, to print books, and how do you get access to, how do you provide access to a print book to a student or a researcher who is in another country or in another library who may need to get access to that book. And we have the technology, and we just the laws need to catch up with the technology. And the other thing I think I would just add, Sean, if I may, that what we have learned from COVID are the lessons of having a flexible exception. So such as fair use, that the libraries in the US relied upon to a large degree during COVID to support remote teaching and research. So the value of open and of the sharing ethos that has really contributed to, to how education was able to continue in some countries and around the world. So we hope that that we can continue those debates at the SCCR, and there will be an information session on COVID at the next SCCR in 2022, and we hope that we can bring some of these issues to the delegates there as well. Thank you.
Great, and I'll just taking us out, just kind of reflect on the last slide that I shared, but just to put that back on, a very small number of countries, only 3, that we have found have explicit references in their copyright statutes to a right to use works under emergency situations. Dominican Republic is one, Cuba and Mexico are the others. And I think we find in Dominican Republic's language, for instance, very much a reflection of Berne Article 17, which, as Alain mentioned, there's some dispute as to whether permit means permit, but at least in the Dominican Republic's law, it does. It presents a necessity justification for permitting use of copyrighted works. And that does begin to open the door and suggest that other countries must have that same right. So I think kind of the question that I'll leave this panel with is, do countries, could countries declare that an educational right that was restricted to use in the classroom, that extends to the virtual space that classroom has become during COVID? Can a library whose copyright law says it can make available digital works on the premises of the library interpret that command to extend to the networked extension of that physical premise into the homes of its patrons who, because of COVID, cannot access that facility? Can a country take a research exception and ensure that it applies to uses of whole works that are necessary for instance, text and data mining research, etc.? So these issues are issues that find a very much an urgency now under COVID. And I think there is a path in which you can see those kind of declarations as being very consistent with the current agreements, but some effort to clarify them through what other processes are being considered in the TRIPS waiver discussion could be useful in pointing a way forward for countries to use the flexibility that they already have to address this crisis. So on that, I believe our time is done for this panel. So I want to thank all of our speakers and all of our attendants, wherever they are. Most of them digitally, and for those that are present as well. But thank you very much to everyone. And I wish I could be there for the coffee afterwards, but we'll just have to, you can find me at www.pijip.org, pijip.org, and more information on these topics is there. So thanks, everybody. Feel free to throw in a last word if you'd like, anyone.
Just taking that opportunity, consider we are in a moment where multilateralism is very important. Solidarity is very important. This is the moment that I think the delegates and the member states could show strength in solidarity by actually allowing copyright to be included within the waiver, within the issues, the rights that must be balanced together with emergency issues like the ones we're living now. Copyright is not only for the arts, it's also for all knowledge, and therefore it must be included if we want to progress towards a more solidarity, multi-level, multinational community like we are trying to do here. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Patricia. Thanks, Dick. And Teresa and Alan.
Thank you.
Okay, cheers.
Bye-bye.